Greetings, BIB 1001, sections 2 and 4. Hope you know that I take no pleasure whatsoever. I gotta start that again.
I like, wow, what are you doing that here?
Greetings, BIB 1001, sections 4 and 2. Hope you know that I take no pleasure whatsoever in not being with you today, but I am so excited, so delighted, such joy to know that you are viewing this and that you are tuned in. We are going to talk a little bit about David and specifically about the promise of God to David. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And you'll recall that we briefly touched upon God's pun, that David was intent on building God a house, a temple, and through the prophet Nathan, God spoke to David and told David, "You're not going to build me a house, I'm going to make you a house, and then your son is going to build me a house." I was a little surprised that none of you were too impressed with God's sense of humor, that none of you were too impressed with God's ability to make puns. Maybe you just didn't get it. But when David wants to build God a house, he's talking about house as a temple. And so God says, David, you're not going to build me a house, a temple. I'm going to make you into a house. And here's the pun, house as a dynasty, that you will have an everlasting dynasty. And then God says that your son is going to be the one to build me a house. And now God flips it again, kind of a double pun, and house means temple once again. I'm really kind of troubled that you don't appreciate God's sense of humor, but that's between you and God. Now, in terms of puns, while we're at it, I know you are missing class today, and I'm trusting that at least a couple of you really do miss class today. Get it? Missing, not there, missing, sorrow, grieving in your heart, wishing you could be there. Anyways, I'm going to go with option number 2, that you really are missing our time together. Well, the promise. The promise was an everlasting dynasty, that you won't fail to have a son on the throne. And one of the things that is unique about this promise is that it was an unconditional promise. God says that I'm not going to pull this promise back from you and from your household, that if your sons are disobedient to me, if they're not keeping covenant, then I will punish them with the rod of men. I will raise up kings, oppressors who will punish them, bring the Deuteronomic curses upon them, but I will not withdraw my commitment to you and to your line to rule through them. And so it's an unconditional promise. That's one of the unique things about this promise. But the most special thing about this promise is not simply that it's unconditional or that it's a promise of a dynasty. The most special thing about it is that God says to David, I will be as a father to your son, and he will be as a son to me. And so this father-son relationship between David's line and God. And so that the next son up to the throne, generation after generation, when they take office as king, they also take office as God's son. And God is a father to them. And they did not see this as if somehow the son would participate in divinity, would somehow become worthy of worship, like some of the other empires did in terms of deifying the emperor. That was never the case in Israel. They understood this father-son relationship in terms of authority and responsibility, so that when the son took office and became king, he became God's son in terms of having the authority and the responsibility to exercise God's rule over God's people. Let me see if I can say that better. God rules up in heaven. And the question is, how does God's rule actually get down to earth? How does God's rule actually get done upon the earth? How does God's rule actually get executed over God's people and really over all the peoples of the earth? And the answer is God's rule is going to get done, be brought down to earth through the Son of David. That David's line, each one who becomes king, becomes their responsibility, and God gives them the authority to do it, to actually execute God's will, God's rule, God's justice over the face of the earth, and in particular over God's people, and eventually all peoples. So how does God's rule get done on the earth? How does God's kingdom come upon the earth? It comes through the line of David. That son is responsible to execute God's rule, God's justice over the earth. Still don't know if you're getting this or not. Maybe not a very good example, but you can think of a car with a very powerful motor. How does that power from the motor actually get the car anywhere? How does it get to the ground? Well, it's through the wheels, through the tires. And so you might think of it in terms of, God's rule. Where does the rubber meet the road? It meets it through David's line. That David's line, generation after generation, each son and succeeding son that comes to the throne, they become the place where God's power gets traction upon earth. And it's their responsibility to execute God's rule, God's justice over the peoples of the earth, and especially over the people of Israel. So maybe this gives a little bit of insight into kingdom of God language. Maybe this gives a little bit of insight into Jesus being called the Son of David, and Jesus saying that God's rule is at hand. The kingdom of God, the rule of God, was to come through the Son of David. And so from a New Testament perspective, Jesus is that Son that God raised up, sent to execute his rule, his justice, his righteousness, his peace over all peoples, over the face of the earth. So when you think about David and you think about the promise of God to David, you're thinking dynasty. You're thinking it is a promise that God will not revoke. It's an unconditional promise. And you're especially thinking that it's through David's line that God's rule, God's justice, God's will get done on the face of the earth. Hope this helps you some in terms of understanding the promise to David. When we meet together in class on Tuesday, and I know you're going to be there, when we meet together in class on Tuesday, we will finish up talking about David and his fall, and then we may get into a bit of First Kings and take a look at Solomon. So I hope you have a great weekend, and be sure to get out to church so that it really is a great weekend. God bless.